You can hear me, right? Let me mute myself on Discord real quick so Mark doesn't get a crazy echo. Okay. I'm going to take a POI from closing at 5:50. If it's 5:50 and I haven't taken it, feel free to speak up in chat or even in audio. Okay. So, get my notes. Okay. Going to start in 3, 2, 1. 3 main points from opening government today. First, we're going to talk about the rise of cosmopolitan culture, what it means exactly, who is affected by it, how it's going to develop in the future. Secondly, we're going to talk about why this makes you less interested in local or national politics and why that's bad. And then third, we're going to talk about why national identification is the most useful form of identification for achieving meaningful positive change in the status quo. Mark is going to talk to you additionally about why cosmopolitan culture is not likely to create any significant change on the international level due to how powerful the current nation state structure currently is and due to backlash mechanisms. First, getting on into this debate, what is the definition of this debate? What is the rise of culture? Predominantly, this is regarding the elites, but potentially even the upper and upper middle class. So these are people that then change their culture. And what does this mean, right? So they don't read the same newspapers. They read probably newspapers from the largest institutions. I read The Economist instead of the local Berlin newspaper. It means the culture I have, the social structures I have are different. I watch international media as opposed to local media. In Germany, I don't watch Tatort. I watch The Queen's Gambit and rave about it with all of my international friends. The people that I communicate with are different. I have fewer friends comparatively. I have more international friends, but fewer friends on the national level. I'm comparatively less inclined to care about local politics or my local government and more inclined to care about what's happening in the global scheme, like with the biggest global players and then also international institutions. The friends I have are living around the world and are more diffuse, okay? So that's specifically what we mean by this. One more point of framing I want to talk about is that, and this is important for the debate, most of the time, the people that opt into this culture are people that are already tending to be more open-minded and more progressive. That means most of the people that opt into this culture are not conservative. They often don't have family values. They often don't care too much about their hometown or like these traditional norms and are much more willing to go into the norms of the global community. That means just in terms of a voting bloc, we're siphoning the most progressive members of our population, often the most educated members of our population, and essentially changing their value system to where they are more aligned with the international system rather than the nation state system. That's a problem. Okay. So the first thing, one final point on framing. The nation state and local politics are the primary methods of actually changing things. At the point where people don't care about it that much, they are less likely to enact effective political change. Now let's get into mechanistic work. 1, why are you less interested in local and national politics, and why is that bad? First, note that you often have the direct ability to enact change on the local or national level. This looks like you having a vote, right? I don't have a vote in any sort of international institution. I can't really influence the UN. What I can do is influence my vote on the local and national level. Also note that my vote is worth more in a relative sense than it would otherwise be because the population is smaller, right? Even if government or opposition teams want to say, we can do both. Note that there is a level of mutual exclusivity here, right? You have a limited attention span. You have a limited amount of cultural milieux that you can inhabit, right? You have to make some sort of a trade-off in types of these things. Even if you still vote and do all of these things in the national election, your vote is probably comparatively less informed, and B, you are also comparatively less likely to do things like voting in local election, which already have a pretty high burden in order for like people to follow regardless, right? This is not something that a lot of people talk about generally, right? So that means that you are less likely to engage in these. But also note that in terms of your power at the local level is that you know the culture and customs and you relate to the people that try to enact the political change more. That is to say, if I want to talk to my friends and advocate about these types of things, I can do so, right? And I know how to connect with them to a far greater extent than I would know how to connect with other people from vastly different cultures. The impact of this is massive because the level of political change is quite high. Like, don't underestimate how important it is that people are involved in, for example, example, citywide governance, because it's this level of governance that can enable things like programs where you feed homelessness, like enacting zoning laws, which have massive influences in terms of whether or not people can afford their apartments, the impact on the nation state in terms of redistributive policy, statewide infrastructure projects, etc. Right? So to the extent they, and finally, to the extent that they stay in policymaking, note that they're going to have different priorities. This is moving on into our second point, which is national identification and why it's important on a policy level. So I already mentioned that on the comparative, they are less likely to identify as part of their own country. That's problematic for a few reasons. I think the first and most obvious reason is that comparatively, they just mind moving away less, right? They have less of a stake in the development of their country because they don't need to worry about the future of their country to the extent that someone that was going to stay in their country 100% of the time does, because they can simply move away to a comparatively better country. I moved away from the US to Germany. Does that make me a bad person? Maybe. But like Germany's pretty nice because I have great healthcare here. I like it a lot, right? This means effectively rich people and like the people that can engage in this type of cosmopolitan culture, because in order to engage in this type of culture, you need to have the resources to travel, to go meet people, to do all these types of things, can more easily opt out of the system. But note secondly, that even if you don't opt out of the system and want to stay in your countries, many policies require making you a sacrifice, or require making a sacrifice such as income redistribution, such as policies which like personally hurt you, but benefit the overall society as a whole, financing infrastructure somewhere in like a region that's not yours, right? So you need shared experiences to build empathy, right? To the extent that you identify with these people more, you are more willing to say, I identify with these people have similar experiences, I am willing to make that sacrifice. I'll go ahead and take a POI from closing.
Okay, is it honestly your experience that people that are worldly and read The Economist don't vote or care about local politics? I just don't think this comes even close to passing a smell test, and the logic is not rigorous at all.
Yeah, but my partner doesn't vote in local elections. I don't vote in local elections. I think we're relatively cosmopolitan people. And the fact is, you have to make a trade-off to some extent. You can't say that you are going to be just as engaged in local and national elections and then also as engaged in cosmopolitan elections for these reasons. If there is no trade-off, there's no debate. I've also told you why they're mutually exclusive. Engage in your speech. But note that you also have a shared language and cultural background with the people and the national level. So you're more likely to there make sacrifices in that regard. So the policies that you vote on the national level are more likely to be liberal, redistributive policies than they would be on a global level. Finally, you have a social accountability feedback from external actors, i.e. if I'm interested in this and I care about the opinions of other people in my community rather than other people in the cosmopolitan community, if they think of me negatively and think I'm not pulling my weight, then I am more likely to respond to their feedback and vote for these policies. Finally, there's an internal aspect in terms of this feedback, in terms of my own guilt that I feel as a result of this, independent of whether or not other people are judging me positively or negatively. So because we proved to you that you are going to be less interested in local and national politics, at least comparatively, and secondly, national identification is one of the most important aspects in terms of passing redistributed policy, and because you're taking away the most progressive people from the voting blocks, at least on the margins, we should absolutely propose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, the Prime Minister, and it's time for Leader of the Opposition to respond.
Can I check that I'm audible before I begin?
Yes, all good.
Thank you. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I'm going to start with a bit of framing, because I think cosmopolitanism at its core, very simply, is just feeling connected to other people from abroad who you don't share a language, culture, or country with. Like feeling that you're a human or a citizen of the world first, beyond national divisions, right? This is not necessarily about your ability to travel and go abroad and meet any of these people in person, right? Because we have things like the internet, we have things like international debating competitions. I am literally in my home in Greece right now, but I'm engaging on a global level with people from all around the world, right? I think cosmopolitanism, crucially, is opposed to nationalism, right? Literally thinking that some people are closer to you because you live in the same country as them, you speak the same language as them, etc. Now, OG gives us a bunch of reasons why you have more in common with these people. I think that is exactly why cosmopolitanism is good, right? Because that is what makes you like see beyond the borders of your own country and vote for policies that benefit everyone, such as, for example, not polluting, say, the ocean and harming island nations just because your country happens to be rich and can avoid that. or not voting specifically for local redistributive policies and then fucking over refugees, but thinking that they are also humans and also worth helping, right? I think this is increasingly important in a globalized world where solutions require, well, global solutions require global problems, other way around, but you get what I'm trying to say. That is going to be my first point, how that cosmopolitanism has been helping with global problems. And my second point will be about how it helps inspire local solutions as well, right? Clashing directly with OG. But let's respond to one of their key sort of claims that we got, which is that you don't care about local politics and local stuff if you like cosmopolitan stuff. I think that's to some extent assertive, but I have two responses to it. Firstly, note that like you don't have to like necessarily like shut yourself off from your own country. Like even if you don't read the local newspaper, you have a more international one. Firstly, that international newspaper probably still mentions the important stuff that goes on in your country. And secondly, by virtue of living in it, having family there, etc., if something big is happening, you're probably going to find out. And then for that week or month, you can focus on that before an election, right? Secondly, though, I think people are aware that national politics is like really important to their lives. Like I am aware that despite considering myself cosmopolitan, my national elections are what changes my life on a day-to-day basis more, which means that at least in the run-up to that, I am going to do my research, and a lot of people are going to do their research to vote. I don't think that claim from OG is substantiated. Finally, though, I think even if they're right and you do care less about the day-to-day national stuff that's going on in your life, I think when you do care, because you have this international experience, this international perspective, you can be more effective in lobbying your government and using creative solutions that have worked in other countries. Like, for example, I know Scandinavian countries do, nationalized healthcare really well. And this is what they do because I read about it in The Economist. I'm going to vote for a local party in my country that wants to do broadly similar stuff because I think that's good. I think that's broadly how that plays out. Let's look about my first constructive argument, how the rise of cosmopolitanism has been helping with the world's greatest problems. I think when you feel like a cosmopolitan, you're more likely to be aware of global issues. Three reasons here. Firstly, just your interest, right? It's an identity you've chosen to embrace, that you care about the world, that you care about all people. You're likely to like be interested in this and Google things as they go on. Secondly, when you have cosmopolitan friends who care about the same kind of stuff, you want to be able to engage in conversation. You want to be able to like know what they're talking about. But thirdly, though, fundamentally, I think you feel a sense of responsibility, right? I think because you're aware that your actions impact people far beyond the reach of your own country, far beyond any places you've ever been. So you feel responsible for not fucking people over in countries that are affected by global warming, for example, through your actions. So you research things, so you look at the news, etc., etc. I think this in practice, this translates to you lobbying for change beyond your own selfish or national interests, right? In two ways. Firstly, through how you express yourself in those local and national elections that OG say you don't care about, right? You realize that your government, particularly if you come from a richer country or a Western country, your government can affect other countries massively. For example, through, buying from sweatshops in less economically developed countries. So you vote for parties that don't do that, or parties that like set stricter regulations as to what can be imported, blah, blah, blah. I think in some cases you can even have more direct influence. Say, for example, in like the case of the EU Parliament, your vote can literally affect people in 27 other countries. There are a lot of unions like that around the world. I think this awareness also means that your government has less power against you with regards to misinformation and stuff, right? If you've read a lot about the rise of authoritarianism, for example, around the world, when your government starts taking pages out of your authoritarian playbook, you go, hold on, that is bad. I should probably protest against this, I should probably vote against this, etc. Secondly, though, even when you don't vote, or in other like times of the year when there are no elections, I think you can still bring about change through your individual actions. For example, choosing to go vegan because you care about the effects of global warming, or choosing not to buy fast fashion because you know that like it's the product of child labor in many cases in other countries. Like, I think on the comparative, because there's a massive opportunity cost to making these decisions, right? Because it's often more expensive or less convenient, right? You are less likely to do it if you don't care about people beyond your own borders as much as you do about yourself and other people who live in your country. So you just don't bother. I think this is important, firstly, because it's the only way to impact like big corporations that essentially run the world when it's so globalized. But secondly, I think it's important to note that this positive trajectory has been primarily happening among young people, and it's likely to increase as they pressure their friends, whereas like, sadly, older people who tend to like, by and large, just generalizing broadly, be more reactionary and nationalist as they like die off or become less politically relevant. Before we move on, I'll take a POI from closing. Gov, if you have one. No? Well, that's all right. I'll be moving on then. Let's move on to my second point about how this helps inspire local solutions as well. And I think it's important here to look at what the common like sort of nationalist response is when you go this other country is doing something really cool that we should be implementing here as well. They go, oh, this is against our values, this is against our culture. They're so different to us. So what they're doing, say, I don't know, over in America wouldn't work here. You get this a lot from, say, more conservative people who are opposed to granting people and minorities rights. If you fundamentally understand that all humans are the same and like national divisions are by and large arbitrary and the same good solutions can be applied elsewhere, you're more likely not to buy that. So firstly, you're more likely to propose and adopt these solutions that work elsewhere. For example, I don't know, humane prisons in Scandinavia or more environmentally friendly stuff. I think the rise of cosmopolitanism can be credited with the fact that the world adopted recycling like almost globally within a couple decades, right? Secondly, though, I think activists in countries where they're fighting against, say, more restrictive LGBT rights or more restrictive abortion rights, because they see and feel more connected with people in other countries that have already gone through the struggle and have already gotten those rights, they go, hold on, that is like the outcome we want. It's working in other places. We should keep fighting because you literally see the outcome and you feel connected to it, right? I think especially if your country like goes back or there's some regression, you go, no, overall in the world, the trend is positive. You don't lose that hope. You keep turning out to marches, you keep lobbying your government and you get that change. On the comparative, you're more likely to buy your government's rhetoric about how your country is fundamentally different and unlikely to change and lose hope and give up. I think that's really bad. I think cosmopolitanism can be credited with a lot of great stuff. Very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech, and it's time for DPM to respond. Here. All good.
Great. Panel, I just want to start by contesting the intuition we got from opening government, because they say that the nation state is the primary method of influencing the international political system, and therefore if people suddenly stop voting in national elections, they won't be able to influence the international system. I think that if two debaters can come up in 15 minutes with the fact that people need to vote nationally in order to change the international system, then someone who cares about the global community more, someone who is cosmopolitan by ideology, probably knows this as well, and therefore I think they are still probably likely to vote in these national elections, which they say are so important. And therefore, I don't think any of these impacts about not enough liberal people voting really accrue, because I think these people also recognize that some of the best way that they can change the international system is to vote nationally. They're just voting for things which are based on like global problems that they think are more important perhaps than local problems, but they still probably vote. And to the extent that I think that parties which care about solving global problems like climate change tend to also be the parties which are allied with left-wing ideals, then I think you probably still get a lot of the redistributive benefits from them voting anyway, because I think they are still the same kind of parties that these people are voting for. But secondly, I think that you probably still do vote, because I don't think the opportunity cost is as big as they say. I think even if you focus the majority of your reading on international issues, and even if you focus the majority of your personal lobbying on international issues, I still think that like national elections come around like once every 4 years. I don't think these people are unlikely to vote simply because of that, because I don't think that trade-off exists to such a significant extent as they say it does. The second thing they say is that you need these shared experiences in order to build empathy. I just think that fundamentally, if you believe that you belong to a global community, then you are more likely to empathize with the most vulnerable people in the world, which is people from the global south who are suffering because of the things that countries in the west are doing. And therefore, to the extent that you are more likely to sympathize with the most vulnerable people, I think you're probably more likely to focus on issues which affect them and actually work towards positive change for them, and therefore giving them an agency which they don't have in the status quo, given the fact that they have disproportionately less power than people in the west. Therefore, to the extent that I think that people in the global south are probably the most vulnerable people in this debate, I think that if we prove to you that you are more likely to empathize with those people on our side of the house and more likely to do things both on an individual level, like changing whether you eat meat or changing the outlets that you buy your fashion from, I think if we prove that you are more likely to help those people, they're probably a more important stakeholder in this debate, and therefore I think we can outweigh that case like in terms of the people it affects. But what were their responses to George's case? I think there were broadly three. The first is that you're not going to care about refugees, you're just going to care about elite people. I think that if you care about like the international community and you do have friends from all over the world, then I think you recognize that countries can go south very quickly, and therefore even if you were once middle class and from a different country, you recognize that that could be you too. So for example, if you have friends in like previously developed countries like in the Middle East, you recognize that some of those who are refugees aren't just people with like no job prospects like the right-wing media say they are, but you recognize that those could have been doctors, that could have been you, because you recognize that like what's more important is your global humanity, and therefore I think you are just more likely to accept them than when you focus on nationalism. No, I don't think they've given you any reasons as to why, given the fact you are likely to be more individualistic and more nationalistic when you focus solely on your local community. Then I think that the point at which there is just a massive global refugee crisis, these people are probably slightly more important than like people within your own country who could maybe benefit from £1 or £2 extra, when these people literally are in camps and have no access to medical supplies or education. So I think that the point at which you're more likely to empathize with them, that is probably just a far more important impact. But the second thing is, I think they just massively conflate nationalism with socialism, because they say that if you are focused more on nationalism, you can redirect that towards socialism. I don't think they give us any concrete reasons as to why, simply because you care about your local community, that makes you more likely to shift nationalism towards socialism, rather than just focusing on individualism and capitalism. I think those are two different things, and I think that like a lot of the nationalist leaders which we look at today are the opposite of socialists, and I don't think that means that they are any more likely to focus on national redistribution. Rather, I think the fact that when you recognize that like you are so privileged to be in that position because you recognize that as part of a global humanity, you could so equally have been born in different circumstances, you're probably more likely to do things like care about the the global poor than you are if you just care about your own nationalist situation. They say, well, if these are the people who have forced nationalism to become more right-wing because they've cared about the international community. I don't think that is the cause of right-wing nationalism. I think a lot of it is due to the poverty which has occurred after the 2008 financial crisis, and also because I think there was just a general backlash from people who don't agree with progressive trends. I think that would have occurred regardless, but the important thing is that once these people die, what the positive trajectory from cosmopolitanism among young people means that more and more people are becoming vegan, that more and more people are thrift shopping rather than shopping from fast fashion. And I think that means that we don't need to focus on nationalism, but rather we want to ensure that young people today still feel like they're part of a global community and still continue to take these actions which actually ensure that we don't lead to the destruction of the human race in like 50 years because we've never cared about climate change, because, oh, well, in Britain, we're not really impacted by the fact that the earth is heating up. In fact, maybe we quite like that. So I think that they never explain why that's actually going to translate to positive changes. And to the extent that we've already proven to you that there is a positive trajectory in status quo towards doing things which care about the global community, and this has had positive impacts, I think the extent to which these positive impacts have occurred is much more is much better than the potential hypothetical impacts of maybe like caring more about your national community. I'll take a POI from closing if they have one.
So far, you've done a very good job of analysing why it is the case that Western elites are going to attempt to make the world a better place. Can you give us a single piece of analysis about why they are likely to be successful in this endeavour?
Yeah, because if you don't ever do anything to change the profit incentive of national, transnational corporations, then they will continue to exploit people in the global south and do things like fast fashion. If fast fashion becomes unsustainable because not enough people are buying the shitty like clothing that you're making, then I think that you just recognize that you should actually be focusing more on like ethical consumerism and changing your brand image. I think that is the only way you impact their profit incentive, and it's the only way to do that is when people like vote with their dollar essentially and change it. I think that is how you change the international system, even if it's not at a political level. I also think that nationally you can vote, so I think that we get more change on our side than like has been proven for the Gov side thus far. So why are our impacts debate winning? Firstly, because we've explained that the most pressing issues facing people are global, but also the most vulnerable people are the global poor rather than your national poor. And therefore you need to buy into international attempts to solve, versus supporting pulling out of international treaties because you feel like it's controlled by other nations, or because you don't want your own nation to be held back at the point at which your nation has to make changes in terms of your like climate policy. I think you are more likely to pull out when you care about your nation more than the international community, but also why you're more likely to take on an individual responsibility and bite that opportunity cost because you care about the global community and you feel like you have that responsibility. So proud to oppose.
Okay, good luck.
Thank you very much for that speech and for the top half so far. And it's time for member of the government to open the case for closing off.
Right. This is good.
You are audible.
Sorry.
No worries.
Before I start, I would like points of information in the Zoom chat. I'll probably take one some point during my speech. I would also like to stress, because this is being streamed or recorded, that the views do not necessarily represent speakers' views. I think the top half of this debate gives you an interesting discussion about whether the West is going to be interfering more in the rest of the world as a result of the rise of cosmopolitan culture. But I think there's very little discussion as to what this interference or action actually looks like, and whether it's actually good for the rest of the world when it comes from a very Western elite perspective in which they think they are right and need to go in and save the rest of the world. So that's the crux of our extension. We're going to explain to you why the rise of cosmopolitan culture makes the West interfere more in the rest of the world, and specifically lots of framing around why this is likely to be harmful to those countries. Rebuttal is going to be integrated. I think the first part of this is to recognize that the rise of cosmopolitan culture, as we've seen so far, is a phenomenon that we've primarily seen in the West for three key reasons. Number one, insofar that this is a culture that's very much related to globalization and the fact that we're more and more connected to each other and should be interacting more with each other in the form of, say, like free trade agreements and those sorts of things. These are things that have rapidly benefited the West in the past few decades a lot more than it has benefited the developing world. So I think number one, globalization has benefited the West. That's the first reason why it's primarily this culture is coming into West. The second is I think this like culture in itself has origins within like liberal internationalism movements and those sorts of theories and ideologies. These are also theories that were dreamt up like within Western universities of the United States and the Western world. I think that in itself also means that this is a culture that's much more common in the West. I think also thirdly, the dominance of Western narratives in international institutions and on the international stage, such as the United Nations, where there's a big focus on spreading so-called universal values and human rights. Like these are values that lots of parts of the world like China and the Middle East actively reject. The fact that there's this dominance of Western narratives in these institutions means that this like cosmopolitan culture narrative that everyone is connected globally and we should all believe in the same thing is a lot more palatable to the West, which already controls narrative, than those in other parts of the world. Why then does the West have like this degree of arrogance about it when it goes into countries around the world? And why does it always think that it's got the best ideas? I think there's two substantial reasons for this. The first is historical, associated with the Cold War and what happened at the end of that. So I think at the end of the Cold War, what we saw was that like the capitalists in America won. There was no real ideological opposition to the ideas coming out of the West. I think the West, like the Western reaction to this is like, we have won the debate on what is best for mankind. We have shown that our ideas, our capitalism, our Western liberalism works best for everyone. See collapse of the Iron Curtain and communist states. I think this also means that the West necessarily sees itself in many cases driven by these narratives and historical reasons as the people who are best able to provide prosperity to other struggling parts of the world. That's a powerful historical narrative in and of itself. Second reason is we think the idea of democratic peace theory, where like it's in the interest of the West and the world to spread democracy as far as possible. I think what this means in many cases is that the Western world is called upon to intervene in other states to try and make them democratic, because they buy into the idea that like if you have democracies, everything will be better, you won't go to war with each other, etc., etc. So I think it's reasonably clear at this point why the West is far more likely to interfere in the affairs of other countries when you have had this rise of cosmopolitan culture. In fact, opening opposition like largely accepts this in this debate. We think like what additionally analytically, when you think that everything is indeed connected, when you as an individual have an obligation to make the world better, not just your own country better, that also makes you take action a lot more. What then are the harms of this? I think there's just like three substantial harms that come out of this attempt by the West to engage with the rest of the world and try and make it better. The first is when it comes to capitalist exploitation. I think that in many cases, when the West tries to get economic development in other countries, see like Kenya, Africa, or whatever, it's by sending in companies, by liberalizing free trade hugely, because these are the things that the West thinks are going to be helpful for these countries. Notice here that number one, the companies going in, despite how much social conscience people within the West themselves have, are still primarily capitalist. That means that these companies are still, as their number one goal, trying to make profit off the locals by paying them wages that are significantly lower than they would be able to get away with in any other parts of the world. We think this is exploitative, we think this is extractative, and we think it's not helpful towards the people in developing countries when you have these big international companies going in as a result of Western interference, allowing them to siphon off significant profits and money back to the West instead of investing in the development of these countries. Notice here that OO's mechanism of like people voting to regulate these companies or voting with their pocketbooks or whatever is just not sufficient, because one, these companies can do a whole lot of PR and just greenwash their products, but like two, even if individuals want to be aware of these things, these are extremely inconvenient actions to take. Like the prevalence of slave labor in fast fashion is so common around the world, and like no one even knows if in many cases if a shirt is like has been made by people being paid a decent wage, or if people have been using like Uyghur labor in Western China. So I think that's the first main harm here. But before I get to the other two harms, I'll take a POI from CO.
Have you thought about the comparative to this? Do you think American companies would just like say, I don't care about intervening anymore, don't care about oil in the Middle East, don't care about banana plantations in South America? I think reasonably the comparative is the same amount of intervention, but with less care about the human impact.
No, so I think I give you lots of structural reasons why the rise of a cosmopolitan culture means that people within the West see themselves as the saviors of the world and see a moral obligation to take these sorts of actions in the rest of the world. I think that explains to you why you get a lot more Western interference that is bad in the rest of the world when you have the rise of cosmopolitan culture. Two other harms then. Harm number two is like Western arrogance. I think the very fact that the West thinks it's right on these sorts of issues and sees it as someone who needs to go and save the rest of the world means that it often develops policies that don't take into account local perspectives or what is actually best for the locals. I think this looks like things like IMF debt policy that requires these countries to massively liberalize the economy and pay back loans and like implement austerity in many cases when this is not necessarily good for the economies. I think this looks like solutions to climate change, often just writing off the Pacific and ignoring the indigenous knowledge and perspectives that people have there. Finally, number three, I think in the most extreme cases, when the West uses this as a justification to intervene militarily and try to spread democracy in other countries, those are the very worst situations. Because I think when the West sees itself as needing to go into another country and fix its system of government, that necessarily means a very long and drawn out intervention that generally, in the case of like Afghanistan or whatever, collapses that government and destroys the lives completely. So I think we show you here why this intervention is more likely and why that's bad. Proud to support the motion.
Thank you very much. And it's time to invite member of the opposition to open the case for closing up. Here.
Sorry, 1 second. I'm just getting my. Okay, if I had to describe the government bench in one word, it would be uncomparative. Firstly, I want to do some framing, and then I'll get into our extension. So Ruth is going to POI this, but I don't think cosmopolitanism is actually limited to elites. Like poor people listen to K-pop, watch anime, and also, by the way, read the news. In fact, immigrant communities come to mind as like probably the most likely to be connected to the global community, despite often containing lots of poor people. I think the framing we got from OG as this being a limited set of elites is kind of ridiculous and never founded. Broadly, some engagement with OG, okay? I would say that engagement in national and local politics is not just not mutually exclusive, but engagement with international politics is a necessary step for beneficial local politics. So there are a few things under this like sub point, right? The first is that they're like often tied directly. So i.e., if I'm an American that cares about, you know, people in Syria or Afghanistan, I'm more likely to vote for politicians based on that. And likewise, I'm probably going to be more passionate about voting in politicians that are going to broadly pass policies that are good for the global community, i.e. better immigration policy, better refugee policy, better trade policy, etc. These things are precisely the political incentives that push you into becoming more involved in local politics when you are more cosmopolitan in nature, i.e. when I care about what's going on in other countries and want to do something to help it, I learn about what is in my power to do, and I start caring more about politics. So OG sort of admits this when they say that national politics is the best way to deal with it. So an example to like clarify this is if I don't like politics at all, but I have a friend in Hong Kong and they tell me about like the protests going on there, and I'm now more personally invested, I'm more likely to use my power as a citizen of like Canada, for example, to choose politicians that are going to do something about it, like sanctions or whatever. Because I want to help my friend by any means possible. Crucially, I may not have cared about politics until I learned about this, but now that I'm looking into politicians' foreign policies that I could like help my friend that I now care about this issue, I learn about their other policies, I care about their local policies, right? This is what opening opposition misses, right? It's the spark that pushed me into like caring about politics. That means I start being more involved in local politics than I otherwise was, right? Being involved in politics is not zero sum. Generally, when I become more interested in politics because of one factor, I'm more interested in politics like in general, and when I know more about the world, that's going to be better. But also, the way I vote in those local politics is also better. So when you like understand the world around you, you can conceptualize local policies in a way that is crucial to passing good ones. So you can understand the local immigration policy in the United States in the context of like American intervention in South America or like the Middle East, for example, which means that you understand that it's not just about building a border wall, but also fundamentally changing the way that America intervenes in these countries to prevent these crises in the first place. Instead of short-sighted solutions like protectionist policies that likely lead to trade wars without any sort of international considerations, or like local immigration immigration policies as described, you can actually think about the like broader issues and resolve underlying crises as opposed to like patching issues by just looking at the local level. So even things that seem entirely local and are used as examples by opening government are also international, right? Like homeless people in your tiny country or tiny county might be the result of like trade policies that left them unemployed, or international drug trade that like got them hooked on heroin, or climate change policy that like made their farming impossible or whatever, right? That span the globe and require solutions that involve an understanding of international factors, or you'll never actually be able to solve those issues. So to the extent that even if it means that you're a little bit less reading about local issues, the fact that you have that international scope means when you vote in local elections, you're more informed about the actual root causes of issues because most of them are international. This is, okay, the second thing I want to extend on is why cultural identity matters. So like OO asserts that being cosmopolitan will make you care more about international politics, but they don't mechanize why this is necessary, because feasibly, like I could care about it without having global culture as part of my identity uniquely, right? So imagine for a moment how Americans would probably feel if the US had just killed 300,000 civilians in Canada or the UK or even like Japan or South Korea. I can guarantee you that there would be overwhelming backlash at the ballot box. And yet, when the United States does the same thing in the Middle East, foreign military policy is given mere minutes in like political debates at the national level, and most Americans couldn't even list the countries where the US is currently at war, let alone find them on a map. Why is this, right? I think that caring about others requires more than just understanding people as an abstract other. It requires human ties through knowing people in those countries, through consuming their media and caring about their culture as if it were your own, and being able to visualize their citizens as complete human beings as opposed to just war statistics, right? This comes from the cultural exchange that the US is able to have with the countries that I just listed, right? It sounds stupid, but like K-pop genuinely does make Americans care more about people in Korea insofar as they understand them as human beings and see how their culture is valuable to them, right? This underlying idea behind essentially contact theory is extremely well established at changing people's views for the better. So sure, some would probably care either way about these policies, but the problem is just a massive apathy among elite, even progressives, right? That looks like a blissful ignorance of, for example, Obama's war crimes in the Middle East, because they don't need to sort of engage with these cultures at a meaningful level. As opening government explained, they focus more inwardly on their own politics, which means they just don't care, even if they otherwise like should. Yeah, note that this happens even when ties are superficial. So like white people just liking the idea of vacationing in Bali will still care more about it sinking underwater as a result. Whereas if they can't even imagine these places in their head in the first place, it's way easier not to care about. Yeah, so why do we get direct results? So some purely local policies are international. So like pig farming policy in the United States will have manure flowing down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico, which affects Mexican fishers. Dams that you build in Sudan will directly affect farmers in Egypt, etc., which means you are necessarily voting on international policy when you vote locally and have the power to affect international policies as a result. I'll take a POI from back half before I continue. No? Okay, I'll continue.
You explain why people are going to care more and try to do good things, but this doesn't engage with the analysis we've given you about how the West often harms people when it thinks it's doing good.
Often this looks, okay, so the comparative is purely selfish policy, right? US military does coups in like South America for their fucking banana companies, or invades Iraq so that Halliburton can get more oil, right? The pushback from people that care about human beings in those companies instead of just profit means that you prevent those companies from doing that very thing. This is actually very powerful, right? Despite Trump wanting to invade Iran, massive public backlash against continued intervention in the Middle East precisely because of growing awareness about the humanitarian crisis that intervention caused mean that you're less likely to intervene. Moreover, the white savior complex that you mechanize on CG is just asserted. I would actually argue the opposite. If I'm broadly aware of another country's culture, way of living, and have respect for it and see it as good, I'm less likely to care about changing it fundamentally. I'm more willing to give them autonomy because I respect other points of view as a more cosmopolitan person, as opposed to thinking locally and seeing my way of life as being the only valid one. I think that is precisely the cause of the bad types of intervention you get on site government. In contrast, I think that on our side, you're able to get people that care about human factors, that care about pulling out of conflict when it's bad, and are able to enact policy that is broadly better for people. And for that reason, I'm incredibly proud to have.
Thank you very much. It's time for summary speeches, starting with the government whip. Here.
Okay, I don't have a video. Soz everyone. Yeah, just type POIs in the chat. No need to unmute. Okay. Okay. What I'm going to do in my speech is fairly simple. I'm going to respond to what you've just heard in terms of the attacks in our case, and then I'm going to do some going through the teams, talking about why we think we beat them. Okay, what attacks have you just heard in our case? Firstly, in the POI, you got the charge that it wasn't comparative. So what do we think the comparative is? Look, if you do not have this cosmopolitan identity, where you identify yourself with the world, we don't think you think it is your business to solve the problems of other countries. Therefore, you do not feel the moral obligation to vote for policies, or if you're like an elite of the country, you don't feel the obligation to you yourself get involved and actually put troops on the ground, do all these things to interfere with foreign countries. We simply feel like you don't feel like you have a moral obligation to do this. Additionally, we think like the corporations who we say don't care about this either way, they're just self-interested, right? We say corporations, in order to be able to do this harmful exploitation, probably need trade agreements, right, to be made. And these trade agreements require the political will of politicians who are motivated by this cosmopolitan stuff, right? So we think, right, this actually happens a lot worse. But they say further, they say, okay, but the comparative is like this selfish intervention, right? We just don't think it's in the interest of Western nations to do all this harmful interfering that they're doing, right? I don't think the invasion of Iraq was a good thing for the United States. It eroded its credibility internationally and cost trillions of dollars, especially when you factor in the cost of dealing with Medicare, which the United States government pays for its soldiers, right? So I don't think this intervention really is in the interest of the United States. We do say that the exploitation of developing countries is like in the interest of corporations, right? But we don't necessarily say that means it's in the interests of the nation itself or even the government. The fact that it's in the interest of these corporations, we're not sure how much people even see the benefit of that, especially when they're not often providing employment in their own countries, but rather in these countries. So maybe they provide some sort of benefit, right? But we don't think like the erosion of the United States credibility, the expensiveness of involvement in these military conflicts, right? You have to balance that against the benefit of like maybe some benefit from corporations, maybe selling cheaper goods, right? We think on the whole, this kind of involvement is probably a negative thing for these Western countries. So their claim that on the comparative, they're going to selfishly intervene in these countries, I don't think stands because they have no analysis into why it's actually in the interest of these countries to do these things with this great deal of intervention, right? We think if you're selfish, you're probably more like Donald Trump and you say America first and you just get involved as little as possible. Now, okay, Donald Trump doesn't consistently carry out, but you think without cosmopolitanism, we're more likely to consistently carry that out and just not be involved. So I think more selfishness, if that is the comparative, leads to countries not being involved in this way that is ultimately harmful. Okay. So what does OG talk about in this debate? OG talks about countries in which there is a great deal of cosmopolitan, right? Their impacts are presumably in any country, the impacts of OG are presumably proportional to the amount of cosmopolitanism that exists in that country, insofar as if this cosmopolitanism is a problem and now these local countries get better because there's more involvement in local politics. Because of this, this only applies to the West. The reason why it only applies to the West is because my partner's analysis about why this is primarily a Western phenomenon. Firstly, tells you about liberal internationalism and how it's an inheritance of Western ideology, and secondly, how the West has how Western corporations have benefited from globalization to some extent, and they push this narrative. No, we don't think society as a whole benefits, but at least the corporations are one thing pushing this narrative. Also, just we think the experience of the global South in terms of imperialism and shit has made it think that the West probably, when it gets involved, does dodgy shit. So we think that's a reason why it's probably not likely to be the case in the global South, because there's those reasons. So consequently, we think the impacts of OG are fairly limited because they only apply to these Western countries, because this is where the cosmopolitan is. We think it's fine, it's good impacts. We just don't think it's as important as our stuff, which applies to the global South, where there are more vulnerable actors and just more people. Okay, what does OO tell you? OO tell you that global problems are solved more effectively. The reason why they think global problems are solved more effectively is because now well-meaning Western elites are going to try and solve these problems. They do a good analysis of explaining this, right? But like I say in my POI, they don't explain to us why it's going to be the case that they're actually going to be successful just because they mean well, they're actually going to do good things. CO has the same problem in their extension, which you just heard from them, in which they give you other reasons why Western elites are going to try and solve these problems. The issue is both OO and CO don't really do a good job explaining to you why it is the case that these Western elites are going to be able to accurately identify what the solutions to these problems are. Andrew gives you structural analysis of the West in terms of both of their ideological history and their economic structure, which leads us to believe that they're not going to do good things. What is the stuff he tells you about their ideological history? Well, look, I would say we defeated communism and there wasn't anything less. This was perceived as winning this ideological battle. And so there was a certain arrogance that Western liberals have where they think their system is the best system. This means they don't try and reason with countries about adopting a better system, but often they try and impose economic sanctions and do things forcefully. we think, and also like because they are capitalists, like when they do have trade, even if the politicians have good intentions for this trade, because it's the capitalist corporations that actually do this, they are primarily self-interested. This interaction happens in a very negative way, which benefits the companies, but does not benefit the actual people of these developing countries. Look at the history of the West in terms of its involvement in these other countries. Never mind like imperialism and stuff, which probably still has a lingering impact, right? We said there's clumsy attempts to create democracies in Libya and Iraq, which have resulted in like civil wars in these countries, which have made things a lot worse. So on top of this corporate exploitation that has happened that's really screwed over the developing world. Additionally, horrible sweatshops that provide short-term employment, but long-term traps these countries into low-skilled employment and doesn't allow them to develop, right? We think primarily when the West tries to do something good, guided by its faith in capitalism and the superiority of its values, it clumsily implements this in a way that makes things a lot worse. Before I move on to really summarize the debate, I'll take a POI from opening.
Countries are likely to invade either way because of profit. The question is whether you are going to get backlash from people in the West when corporations and countries do that. That is more likely to happen when people are cosmopolitan and feel bad for people working in sweatshops because of their shared humanity, as opposed to seeing them as inferior because they don't share a passport. Please engage.
Cool. So that repeats the CO attack on our case, which is to say that like you are now more, or parts of CO's extension, I guess, which is now you are now more aware that America kind of causes these problems due to its foreign policy, and we've caused these problems, so now we need to solve them. Like, given all of our structural analysis, you probably don't think that capitalism and Western liberalism, or the attempt to implement Western liberalism, caused this problems. In fact, you probably think like this made problems less bad, right? All the structural analysis indicates that they don't respond in this way to actually identify accurately what these problems are and make them better. So yeah, we think probably like they don't actually make things better. Okay, so yeah, the West makes things worse, essentially, when it tries to interfere with this country. I think if you look at the history of Western for these countries, it's often just been like quite a bad, negative experience. Okay. 7 minutes, there we go.
Thank you. And it's time for the last speech of this debate. Up with, here.
Just give me 1 second. For POIs, you can ask them in the chat, and if I don't take you by 5:30, you can ask me out loud. Okay, I'm going to talk about 2 things. First on local politics and second on international policy. All like refutation and weighing is going to be integrated. On local politics, so this is mostly going to take out opening government and outweigh our opening. So I think opening government largely comes up here, and they tell us that like there's a necessary trade-off wherein people are going to become less invested in local politics when they start spending more time like thinking about like international news, and this is a bunch of harms. 2 things that we do in extension to respond to this and flip their claim. So the first thing that we tell you is that it's very unclear the scale of like benefit that OG is able to get. This is to say that even if you are marginally like less involved within local politics, so maybe you're not reading like your local daily news all the time, presumably in the majority of places that are not America, elections last for like a 1-month polling period, not for like 3 years where you need to be constantly like learning about things in order to vote. And people can learn enough to a reasonable degree that they're still able to like vote and engage with politics. It's unclear to me what the average person actually needs to do politically. If you're able to elect someone into office who spends the majority of their time like doing the groundwork, like that's presumably enough. And I don't think OG did enough to ever once in their speech prove a tipping point that you're going to have locally when you spend more time there, as opposed to what Jacob and I tell you, which is like the importance that you can have on learning about international affairs and how that might lead to you being a more informed voter and like voting in ways that get to concrete, better policy. That does have a meaningful tipping point, so the weighing would fall to our side. The second major hole in the OG case is that they make the assumption that learning about global news is antithetical to learning about local news. What do we tell you on CO? We posit that like as opposed to the 2 being mutually exclusive, they're actually interlinked in a way where learning about global news does 2 things. 1, it can oftentimes spark people to become more engaged in politics. So this is helpful in flipping OG again, because it proves that in some cases, not only only do people like not become less engaged, as OG says, but in some cases, learning about international politics might be something that you're just more interested in, because you're like formulating more friendships with people internationally and like picking up new media sources. You might become more engaged and start to read more than you ever did before. Like politics is not a zero-sum game. People can choose to the degree to which they engage. We'd say you might engage now than ever before. But the second thing we tell you on CO is that learning about global news has a direct effect on your ability to vote locally. This is to say that oftentimes, like foreign intervention, let's say, is a direct result of what you do locally, right? So if your country is going to like intervene like in a foreign affair, your like local vote, in order to like make an informed decision, you sometimes just need to know about international policy, right? So it's very unclear to me like what OG thinks like are voting issues. For a lot of voters, key voting issues look like things like asylum policy, like refugee policy, like climate change policy, like if your government is going to like, I don't know, be willingly engaging in war crimes or like intervene in other nations, what their international economic policy is going to look like, their willingness to accept like international like foreigners and citizenship status. These are all policies that are directly affected by when you learn about international news, and therefore lead you to vote locally in a far better way. But moreover, what Jacob tells you in extension is that you're now able to vote on policies that are structurally better because you understand the root causes of issues that occur locally, because oftentimes like problems that occur locally are an effect of international events, i.e. international events in like farming in places and international economic international economic affairs or like have a direct effect on maybe your country being in poverty now. And so your ability to understand how global events led to where you are today might help you vote on more informed policy. So in this way, we are able to not only flip OG by proving to you why it is the case that learning about international events helps you vote in a more informed way locally, but second, we outweigh our opening here, because I would note that OO largely talks to you about holding your government accountable, but what Jacob and I uniquely tell you is how you're only able to do this through learning about, like through having a cosmopolitan mindset and through learning about international affairs. That's the direct mechanism through which you're able to engage locally in ways that lead to better structural policy. But the second thing we do that our opening misses is we explain to you why it's not like a zero-sum game, why you're able to be more informed, and why this amount of more informedness helps you. I will take OG.
You say you have a Hong Kong friend who is going to tell you to vote nationally to sanction China, but the real comparative is you instead having a local friend, presumably from a more diverse group comparatively, telling you to vote for a nice policy to help him out.
Yeah, so I just don't think that these are mutually exclusive, right? Like I can vote for like my friends, like for someone who is going to like do good for someone in Hong Kong, but also vote for welfare. Given the framing of OG, which is that you're a super progressive person, it's unclear to me that the candidate you're going to be electing locally actually is going to be like super different here. I think that like you can be informed enough that you can learn about the candidates you're electing locally, but as well as their international affairs. Okay, the last thing I would flag here is that most countries are not the United States, right? I think Jacob talks to you about like why in cases where it's like the United States and their intervention, this is better. But we'd say that in many cases, it's just about small intervention, right? That things that are always going to happen. Like you're always going to have, to some extent, rivers that cross through countries where you polluting in rivers has an effect on like your neighboring nation, right? So we'd say in these cases, it becomes necessary to learn about your neighboring nation, and you can't escape from it. So given no one on GovBench properly proved an ability to have escapism there, Jacob and I would posit that you learning about countries surrounding you is not just like something that is important for you locally, but is a necessary precondition to have good local policy. Okay, next I want to talk, so I think that's why we get better local policy on net. I think we're the only team to prove this to you. On international policy. So largely here, we do, I think, like a few things. So the first thing is I will respond to the CG case. So CG asserts that a white savior complex comes as a result of cosmopolitanism. Jacob and I would argue that this is not like true, right? We'd say white savior complex was more that the West wanted to intervene places, and so they needed a reason for this. We'd say that the comparative is likely they still did interference, they just gave a different type of justification. I don't think interference fully goes away, right? So a lot of times this happens for like economic gain or for like geopolitical power and gain. Interference still happens, right? What then do we say comparatively happens better on our side? A few things. First, we go beyond opening opposition and actually mechanizing how sympathy occurs and why you start to care about people only through cosmopolitanism. So check your flow. All OO does is really say that sympathy occurs. What Jacob tells you in extension is that this comes through being able to like humanize and visualize citizens through learning about their culture and connecting them with real ways in which you can formulate them as a person that is like akin to you and someone that is relatable to you. So I think we go beyond them and talking about why you care about it. But the second thing we tell you is that you're now able to do things like hold your government accountable to the actions that are occurring, because you're focused more on the types of international policy that is occurring, right? So I would say, like, if here's like an example of the comparative. So like if a politician says like we need to stop a communist dictator in Iran, you might think like I heard of these people, like, sure, whatever, you'll vote for it, you'll say it sounds good. On our side, you might think that, like, humanize someone, think, oh, I know someone who was living there, they told me that leaders are democratically elected, and because of that you aren't going to support that type of policy. These changes in terms of international intervention uniquely happen on our side. Protestants know.
Thank you very much, Upwith. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you, audio visuals, for this recording. If you can please take stream down, thank you. And all of you, click leave breakout room. Be back when we will call you back. Should be in 15 minutes. Bye-bye. Hi, Vim. Let's take 2 minutes and then start chatting.
Okay, cool.
Are you ready to chat?
Can you give me 30 seconds?
Yeah, sure.